Greetings and welcome to Lobes and Robes, How Neuroscience Can Change the World. This podcast is sponsored by the American University Center for Neuroscience and Behavior and explores the links between neuroscience and key policy questions today. I'm Susan Carl, a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, and I will help lead discussions throughout our series along with Dr. Terry Davidson, Director of the Center for Neuroscience and Behavior at American University and a distinguished professor of neuroscience here. This podcast is for anyone interested in how scientific discovery can make the world a better place. Thanks for listening.
Our guest today is Dr. Jibran Khokhar, PhD, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anatomy and Cell Biology at the University of Western Ontario's Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry. Dr. Khokhar is known for his translational neuropharmacological work at the intersection of addiction and mental illness. Combining preclinical neuroimaging with cutting-edge neuroscience tools, his laboratory reverse translates findings from human clinical studies into rodent models with the interrelated goals of advancing basic knowledge about the neural mechanisms that underlie co-occurring addictions and serious mental health disorders, and developing treatments, effective treatments, for patients who are living with these conditions. Dr. Khokhar is also working on profiling the pharmacokinetic parameters associated with different routes of exposure to drugs like nicotine and cannabis, as well as the impact of stage of development and sex on these profiles. Of special interest for our podcast today, Dr. Khokhar is one of a small number of neuroscientists who become interested in the effects of discrimination of various forms on the brain of its victims and on the brains of what he has termed the consumers of discrimination. In this regard, his analysis of the effects of Islamophobia are particularly insightful. Dr. Khokhar, we welcome you as our guest to the Lobes and Robe podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Terry and Susan.
So we want to sort of start general and then get into more specifics. So maybe could you describe your interest in the topic of the neuroscience of Islamophobia and how those interests are linked to the work we just heard that your lab does?
Yeah, so I think there are sort of personal relations between them and then more academic interests. As far as the work in the lab is concerned, it really focuses on co-occurring substance use and serious mental illness, which is often the rule and not the exception when it comes to these things, as these disorders often co-occur. But our lab is very interested in understanding what the genetic and the environmental contributions to the development of these disorders are. And so what that then results in is a keen eye toward trying to identify what might be these environmental factors that contribute and how they may relate to things that either I have personally experienced or others from my family or folks that I have known that have experienced, and to see if they're, at a n=1, but also at a population level, see if any of that can be traced back to specific incidents or a general sense of being othered or being discriminated against that might contribute to this. And, neuroscience as a whole is now finally starting to turn an eye towards this. We haven't looked at it for too long. In fact, for most of the history of neuroscience, populations that weren't mainstream or majoritarian were often not studied. And, even when they were studied, it was often in the context of, well, these are the race-related differences. And, whether be it in the context of brain region volume between African American and white Americans. And now, finally, with additional research, we're starting to see that it may not actually be related to race, but may be related to early experiences of trauma or social discrimination or adverse childhood events that arise from racism. And so I think us as a field of neuroscience, we're finally starting to turn an eye towards this. And so that makes it also topical and relevant in the broader discussions. I think those reasons come together to make my interest in this topic happen.
That's awesome.
I know I've seen your YouTube presentation on Islamophobia, and I was just wondering if you tell us something. Is Islamophobia different than other forms of discriminatory behavior, particularly with respect to its effects on the brain? As you know, I'm a neuroscientist like you, and so a lot of my questions will be focused within the context of what's going on in the brain of people who either are victims or, as you say, consumers.
To be honest, I don't think there are too many differences between different types of hate and social discrimination and the trauma that results from that. I think for the brain, a lot of the exogenous influences and stimuli are processed the same way. So I don't think there are many outright differences, and I don't really have much data to back that up because there have been no studies systematically assessing the effects of Islamophobia on the brain. And so what we can only lean on is studies that have looked at other types of discrimination and sort of draw the line across. But I think it is important to recognize that Islamophobia is intersectional. Right. And so, for example, if somebody experiences discrimination on the basis of, for example, women are often the primary target for Islamophobic attacks that are physical in nature, because firstly, due to the hijab or the head covering, they are often the most visible representatives of the religion. But beyond that, even thinking about Black Muslims, they are often the subject of discrimination based on their multiple identities. And so I think we should recognize that fact as well, that while this might not be different from other types of discrimination, there might be layers to it that may intersect with each other and with an effect that might be greater than the sum of the parts. And so I think that's an important consideration when we do talk about whether this is different or similar, is that there are multiple moving parts to this and multiple identities that may become the source of discrimination for an individual.
Could you just summarize what the data show in terms of what are the effects of discrimination on the brains of people who are subject to identity-based discrimination?
The data is considerable in terms of both direct neural correlates, where they have, maybe taken individuals that have experienced social discrimination event, for example, and looked at activity in the brain and functional connectivity in the brain. When they have shown that the activity of one brain region, for example, the amygdala, were associated with somebody who had increased discrimination, they were associated with stronger functional connectivity of the amygdala and several other brain regions, including the anterior insula, which is, involved in those interoceptive processes, the putamen, the caudate, the anterior cingulate, the medial frontal gyrus. And so those are just as, one study that I can think of. But beyond that, so there's the studies that have sort of looked at the neural correlates, and then others that have looked at sort of the epidemiological incidence of various sequelae or the impacts of experiences of discrimination. And then those would show across various populations, everything from African Americans to sexual and gender minorities to Muslims to even anti-Semitism being associated with increased risk for everything from depression to anxiety to generalized anxiety disorder diagnoses or substance use, alcohol use, paranoia, both subclinical and clinical paranoia. One specific study comes to mind with that used a Muslim context that was published a couple of years ago now in JAMA Psychiatry, where even compared to other religious groups, Muslim respondents were over 2 times more likely to report a lifetime suicide attempt. And so there are direct effects on the brain, which are limited in terms of the studies that have been done. But then there are also population level effects that are obviously mediated by the brain, but we don't have the neural correlates specifically to be able to pinpoint that this is the brain region or this is the change that's happening and this is when it happened. And so causality, we're quite a bit away from, but as far as associations are concerned, there are considerable data that would support that.
Jibran, you mentioned something about, layers. And one of the things I was kind of interested in is I know you've talked about direct physical manifestations compared to psychological. Could you describe these different types of manifestations? And then also, I'm interested in what you think is most important.
So the direct physical manifestations are, when I think of those, I think of physical attacks, be it the shooting in Christchurch, be it the mosque shooting that happened in Quebec City in Canada, be it the running over or the killing of, 4 family members here in the city where I am now, London, Ontario, just on June 6th, a year and a half ago now, where, a family was targeted because of their Muslim identity. So those are the physical effects that I am referring to. And those, Christchurch is probably one of the larger ones that affected, 50 or more people. And so the numbers of those, or the number of people that end up being affected by it are probably not as large. But then the psychological ramifications are those that end up sort of affecting the broader public that has identities that intersect with or relate to the people that are targeted in those specific attacks. And I think that is probably more prevalent and more insidious. And if there is something that I have seen in the last 8 months of living in London, Ontario, is the constant state of fear that Muslim women specifically find themselves in when crossing the street or when walking out and about in a city where an event happened so recently. So I think there is this constant level of psychological stress that, discrimination by itself is a stressor, but in addition to that, there's a heightened level of sort of threat detection that is there, especially in the aftermath of incidents like these, where at all times you are looking out for or maybe even expecting a threat of some sort. And just yesterday, I think in New Jersey, there was a stabbing of a inside the mosque of a religious cleric who was leading the prayer, and this happened during the prayer. And in Canada here, just maybe 120 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now, there was an attempted right outside the mosque after prayers, an attempt to run over some of the congregants. And so the fact that it keeps happening over and over again then adds to that layer of ever-present fear and threat. That is what I'm referring to when I say the possibly more insidious psychological impacts.
I guess you really can't then say, obviously, what's more harmful or more important. One, if I'm understanding you right, is that it's really the direct contact of the victim of an assault, for example, whereas the psychological effect extends to everyone who kind of belongs to the same group as that person who's been assaulted.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to say, I guess, which one of those is worse. They're both terrible.
Yeah, it's just that, the larger number of people that end up being impacted by it. And oftentimes, it may not even be perceived by those individuals that are sort of feeling that constant psychological stress as a result of it. It doesn't have to be perceived for it to have an effect on the brain, and as a result an effect on the rest of the body as well. So we know all about amygdala activation and its impact on the HPA axis, and how that might be contributing to this heightened state of awareness and stress that is probably there, but it's just that we haven't studied it. And so I think hopefully, if nothing else, a conversation like this can encourage more research into a topic like this. And I think neuroscience as a whole is starting to finally come around to the idea of what social discrimination, what racial trauma, what hate might even look like at the level of the brain.
Yeah, it seems like such important research to be doing. And we're going to have a lot more questions for you about the implications of all of that research. But before we delve into all of that, just one more kind of preliminary question that might be helpful as we go along, which is, we know that you talk about in your research the difference between victims of discrimination, and then also what you call consumers or observers of discrimination, which seems to be an important distinction. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, and also on whether the observers, for there to be an impact on the brain of observers, do they have to be part of the same identity group, or do those impacts happen even to people who are not part of the identity group that's been subject to harassment or violence?
When I have in the past referred to the observers or the consumers, I'm usually referring to people outside the identity group, and that might be somebody who is a Fox News enthusiast, or somebody who a viewer, or somebody who is exposed to rhetoric that continues to, either be specifically hate speech, but could even just be connotations related to hate speech, or insinuations. Or in the US, the perfect example is the narratives around Ilhan Omar, for example, right? I think the amount of stereotyping that ends up going into the narratives around Ilhan Omar actually end up serving or fueling that fire to a greater extent. And so that's what I am referring to when I am talking about the consumer. And it's, that's where repetitive exposures to hate speech, for example, can lead to desensitization, even lower evaluations of the victims, and greater prejudice. Even a blatant dehumanization has also been observed in those that are repetitively exposed to this type of content. So I think that's an important consideration of what it's doing to the brain. And I think, and we'll talk about it more, I guess, later, but it's really interesting that the same brain circuits that are resulting in this state of heightened fear in the victims and those associated or those identify with the identities of the victims, as the ones that are often being activated in the individuals that are on the receiving end of the rhetoric and the narratives, right? And so threatening language, fear mongering also activates the amygdala, which then makes it that much harder to dial down either the emotions or even the fight or flight response that becomes directly activated as a result of that amygdala activation. So I think, to Terry's earlier question, is this different or similar at the level of the brain? Even opposing experiences can have similar neural mechanisms as well as similar downstream effects. And so, which makes the studying of this important squishy blob that we have in our heads that much more important.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And you already mentioned also other kinds of sort of psychiatric disorders like depression and anxiety and all of those kinds of things. Can you go into, in a little more depth, the evidence that indicates this relationship between discrimination and various kinds of psychiatric issues that the brain will experience?
Yeah. So, I think while I might not have all the numbers right in front of me, I think there is some interesting conversations that I've had recently with friends who are psychiatrists and who have mentioned seeing a lot of transition aged youth that might be transitioning from services that are offered for youth to adult services, and how they're seeing a lot of youth that are Muslim identifying have psychotic related or psychosis related disorders. I mean, it's interesting because some of the persecutory thoughts or hallucinations are related to surveillance by police. And so that becomes that much more of a, not just a red flag, but because a lot of these youth may have grown up in communities that were often targeted by surveillance, it may make sense that this is it may be easier to even draw more of a causal line compared to something else like depression or anxiety or alcohol use, where it might not be possible to draw as direct of a line or a link. But as far as some of the numbers are concerned, when somebody is called an offensive name based on their Muslim identity, the odds ratio for depression is 3.39. Or when somebody's singled out by law enforcement, that odds ratio is around 2.5, 2.6. And so, as somebody who's often had to travel while Muslim or travel while brown. I can attest to the cues and the context of just passing through an airport being deeply distressing. And so I can imagine how this would be something that would be easily experienced by a large majority of the people that identify as such. And as a result, those numbers may even be underestimates. That probably is also probably contributed to by the stigmatization around mental illness in the Muslim community. So that's another reason for a potential underreporting of any such associations as well. But beyond that, when it comes to alcohol use in Muslim women who have experienced a perceived Islamophobic incident, the odds ratio is around 2, associated with subclinical paranoia. And so again, it's coming back to that point, and some of that paranoia might be related to surveillance or law enforcement. So I think there is probably something there that needs a deeper look that might not be as transferable or generalizable from other groups that are discriminated against in similar ways. And then the point that I was making earlier about the increased suicidality, that's another important piece of the puzzle, especially because once again, the stigma around suicidality within the community is also huge. And so even those numbers that we do have may still be the tip of the iceberg.
Great. That's very helpful. Thank you. So I'm curious, as a complete layperson on these things, how you were talking earlier about the various circuits of the brain that are affected by discrimination and racism. And I'm wondering, how do you study those effects? What shows you what the effects are?
The studies have taken sort of different approaches to this, right? Some have taken a self-report based approach where somebody fills out a questionnaire related to how much or how many incidents or how often they've experienced discrimination. And then you can scan that individual inside an MRI magnet or a positron emission tomography scanner to look at some of the neurochemical changes. Or you can do an EEG based study. And that's where, again, it's an important conversation that I think we should mention, that for the most part, and there was a recent issue of Nature Neuroscience, which is a flagship journal in the field, that had a very effective and poignant way of demonstrating it, where they had a building, and inside the building were the scanners and the experimenters, and inside the scanners were mostly majoritarian groups, mostly white individuals, for example. And outside the building, on the outside looking in, were women and racial minorities and individuals with disabilities and sexual and gender minorities. And so that's, for the most part, they're on the outside looking in. And even practically, it's important to consider that most of electroencephalography, EEG based assessments require a head cap to be worn that collects electrical activity from the brain, and a lot of those are sometimes not compatible with different types of hair, as an example. So there, even how we study it is impacted by the sort of biases that exist in the system. So I think there's an important consideration around that. And there are some really wonderful researchers, Nathaniel Hartnett being one of them, who's at Harvard Medical School, who's now revisiting some of the data that exists, even, showing race-related differences, and actually talks about how these might be related more to adverse childhood experiences as a result of racial trauma or racial discrimination, and not actually race-related differences in brain volume, as an example. And so there's a lot of wonderful studies that are coming out that talk about the impact of toxic stress, for example, that arises from racial discrimination or social discrimination of other sorts, and the effects of that toxic stress on the brain and the development of the brain, but also the function and structure of the brain. And so I think but even then, as I mentioned, it should be taken with a grain of salt, because the number of studies that have looked at are few and far between. And some studies have taken it a step further to try to experimentally assess it. So either through recounting stories of discrimination inside the magnet, and so then looking at moving away from rest based activity measures or resting state correlations to then specific evocations or task based associations of activity in the brain. And, unfortunately, that data still remains somewhat causal because we're not able to manipulate brain circuits in humans. And so there is some attempts now. This was at the last American College of Neuropsychiatry, of Neuropsychopharmacology meeting, where even preclinical researchers are now starting to look at the effects of social discrimination in animal models and how that might causally change the circuitry in the brain. So I think there is some work that is now developing that may help us eventually get there.
That's fascinating.
You mentioned the animal models. I know a lot of your work you describe as reverse translational. I understand that. You find a human disorder and then try to understand using an animal model what the brain substrates are. I assume this is really in its infancy with respect to studying things like discrimination or Islamophobia. That is the study of the brains of non-human animal models. Is that correct, or is some progress being made there?
I think it is correct that it is very much in its infancy. I think, maybe there's been one paper. And so, Garrett Stuber's name comes to mind. He's the postdoc from his lab, and I can't remember her name right now, that presented some of that data. So he's been looking at how social isolation and social, essentially discrimination in a mouse model sort of co-opts a lot of those fear and aggression circuits in the brain. So I think there is now more work that is trying to see how much of this can be modeled. And I think there is greater need for some of this research, and we may be able to leverage non-human primates that have defined social structures to be able to get at some of this as well.
Now, if you believe in evolution, you would think that there should be some correspondence and probably some knowledge to be gained from species other than humans.
Totally. And, if you think about the brain is the brain. And, the same thing that relates or results in threat detection from a avian predator for a mouse is the same brain region that results in threat detection when it comes to seeing somebody who's not from your in group and is from an out group. And, you see similar activation when seeing, Black individuals, for example, of the amygdala. And so there is, and, maybe we can even use some of that, right? So just like in animal studies, and you're an expert in this, that we can do extinction of through re-exposing to light and sound cues, maybe through creating more inclusive societies where you are then exposed to individuals who look different from you, can result in some level of extinction or some level of non-experimental, real-time, societal level exposure therapy, whereby seeing more people that are different, look different, identify differently from you, over time you can ramp down those threat detection mechanisms that our brain has, and hopefully create for a more inclusive society along the way.
Yeah, we really want to ask you about that and what the literature shows on that. I've tried to read it as a layperson, and I have one impression, but I'm really curious a little bit later in our discussion to get into all of that. But I have one question that I've always wondered about, which is, does the data show, and maybe it's too early for it to show this, but is there a difference between ostracization and exclusion and stigma that occurs based on insider outsider characteristics like social identity versus just individual personality? So like in the animal kingdom, there's lots of examples of how a certain creature will be excluded from its social group and usually ends up dying as a result. But is there something special about that occurring because of identity characteristics? Do we know, or is it anybody who's subjected to stigma and hate and ostracization?
I don't know if I can necessarily answer this question with evidence, and I don't know if that exists, but it's it does come down to in versus out group dynamics, right? Even when you look at sports fans identifying with their team versus an opposite team, you see that the failures of a fellow group member are painful, whereas those of a rival group member are pleasurable and may cause, or maybe associated with all sorts of pleasurable changes in the brain that may actually then motivate the at least either actively or maybe passively perpetuating harm towards the rival groups, because anything that is pleasurable or rewarding in the brain can then be invigorated, right? That's the purpose of these circuits within the brain, is to invigorate those behaviors and to make it happen more often. And so I think the in group versus out group dynamics definitely contribute to it. But beyond that, right, like I think there's also social factors that egg that along, right? So whenever there's economic scarcity, for example, or election cycles. I remember living in the US through the Muslim ban that came through. And even in Canada, the last election there was the party that did not end up winning was created specifically a barbaric practices hotline to try to so that people could call in if they saw a Muslim on the street that looked barbaric to them. And so I think there are social factors that sort of egg on that in versus out group dynamic. And I think it goes beyond just personality or personal preferences.
Oh, of course. Of course. Yeah. I was just wondering, if there was a difference in the effects on the brain depending on what the motivations were of the excluders. Totally different question, but absolutely. I hear what you're saying. I wasn't meaning to imply anything.
I don't think you were meaning to imply that. I was just saying that it's important to consider that, and it doesn't have to be explicit either, right? And so there even looking at the dehumanization data, there's maybe an less than explicit or implicit bias or dehumanization that exists, and that, for example, in a study that looked at, they were looking at these reverse correlation experiments that in US respondents, where their mental representations of Arabs were significantly more dehumanizing than their representations of Americans. But what was interesting about this is that this phenomenon was not reproducible to the general tendency to the people that they sampled to mentally represent Arabs more negatively than Americans. This was, sort of implicit, but beyond that, they found that these blatantly dehumanizing representations of Arabs were just as prevalent in the people exhibiting low levels of explicit dehumanization, so liberals, for example. And so they wouldn't, when they talked about it, they wouldn't dehumanize anybody with their language explicitly, as it was in the individuals that were exhibiting higher levels of explicit dehumanization. So conservatives, for example. So which suggests that it's possible that even those that are actively trying to stay away or trying to not be explicit in their dehumanization may in fact end up being less aware of the implicit dehumanizing tendencies that they have. And that's where the power of the narratives in the media can be so powerful, because they end up affecting both the explicit and the implicit, the conscious and the subconscious, and they end up having effects that a person may not even recognize that they are being affected by.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's the findings of the implicit bias testing as well.
Yes, totally.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that these stereotypes and dehumanizing tendencies exist not only in the majority population, but also in people who belong to the identity category themselves.
Totally.
That's what I understand from the implicit bias.
And and how a lot of those narratives can end up being internalized as well.
Exactly.
And I think that goes back to the earlier point about how insidious those psychological or impacts on the psyche might be. They can have a lot of different forms. It just doesn't have to be feeling the constant threat. It can also come through the aspects of internalization of a lot of the rhetoric and the narratives that exist.
One thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things, and a new idea that I'm getting from you that I find so profound and need to go back and think about is how these phenomena occur both in the people who are the victims of dehumanization and the people who are the perpetrators of it, and that it's sort of like the flip side of the same thing. And that's just really fascinating. Yeah. So this brings us to a question that we have been wanting to ask you, which is, is there data showing that the impacts on the brain according to the age of the person? So are some age groups affected more than others?
I think the brain is the brain, right? And as far as the brain is concerned, insults mean different things along that developmental profile. And so, even in the lab, we study the impact of early exposure to substances or social isolation or other neurodevelopmental insults, right? And those have more long term consequences on the brain that is developing compared to a fully developed brain. And so, I think this then applies the same way to race related differences, right? And so the same person that I was mentioning, Nathaniel Hartnett, he's shown recently that, and others as well, that uh, these are racial trauma and are adverse childhood experiences that have long ranging consequences. And so, in a recent study that he just published, I think this was February 2023, Black children experienced more traumatic events compared to white children. And in addition to that, their parents or caregivers had lower income, more unemployment, and they saw lower amygdala, hippocampus, PFC, gray matter volume compared to the white children. And the volumes of the PFC and the amygdala, but not the hippocampus, also varied with the metrics of childhood adversity. And income was one of the more important predictors of brain volume differences. And so it's, again, what may have been attributed to previously to race-related differences may actually, especially in regions that are associated with, threat-related processes, may in fact be related to other factors that might co-localize with race that may be more important and may serve as those adverse childhood experiences that then have the long-term effects on the brain. And I think that's really important. And I remember this vividly. One instance, we were held at, I did my postdoc in New Hampshire at Dartmouth College, and I had to, when I got an award, and I had to switch my visas from a J1 visa to another type of visa, we were held at the border for, I think, 6 hours. And some of the line of questioning that my wife and I got was like, do you know where Osama bin Laden was killed? And all sorts of things like that. But I remember my then 4-year-old asking why don't they like us, and so this starts early, and the kids can be rather perceptive to being othered. So I think it's not that we can just chalk it up to, oh, they're kids, they'll be fine, kids are resilient. They can be rather perceptive, and so if anything becomes an adverse childhood experience, it will probably have long-term consequences.
It makes perfect sense to me. Of course, that has to be true. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. Another area that we wanted to talk to you about is what kinds of interventions may be helpful or ameliorate all of the consequences on the brain, both of victims and of consumers. What do you draw from the data on possible interventions?
I think the point that I made earlier about exposure therapy, right? I think that, but then also I think recognizing in the implicit bias assessments, as you mentioned, I think more of us need to do some self-evaluation in these regards, right? Like even in how that is impacted, but also I think there's an important need to challenge and question the narratives that think about it in the context of the war on Iraq, right? Which now we know was based on false pretenses, but then how much propaganda and how much the media narrative revolved around Islamophobia that now has contributed to probably a lot more adverse outcomes. So I think it's important that we at dinner tables, at Thanksgiving and family gatherings, even though you should not talk about politics at those tables, if you do see, this might be a triggering term for a lot of Muslim identifying people, but if you see something, say something. Like maybe this is the right way of using that term instead of how it has been used for surveillance in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. The data that I know of through the implicit bias studies, unfortunately, isn't as positive as we might want it to be, in the sense that a lot of really thoughtful interventions don't seem to make that much difference. And especially in the longer term. Intervention that occurs right before a decision that could be loaded with implicit bias is made can be effective, but the effects won't last for very long.
Yeah, and that seems to be...
Is that your sense?
That seems to be my reading of it as well. But at least we can maybe prevent it from being worsened, right? Like, so even, we see that dehumanization, for example, spike right after an attack, for example. And that usually when you're inundated with all sorts of media narratives about it. And so there is an important piece that the media continues to play, that at the very least we can challenge to not worsen it, even if we can't improve it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And can we switch to the other side too? Because I don't know anything about this, but it seems so important, which is, are there interventions for the people who have been victimized by hate and prejudice? Are there interventions that help? Are some interventions more effective than others, or in sort of doing the repair and healing there?
Yeah, no, so I think of I don't think should probably look into that as well. I think a lot of people are probably on journeys on their own to recover from various incidents and traumas that they have experienced. And so, psychotherapy might help in that way, but I don't think I know of anything that helps at a sort of population level, right? But I think there is a need to recognize that there are sort of systemic biases even in the healthcare system, right? And that our training of the healthcare establishment, for example, there are still some very problematic content that's taught around racial differences in pain perception, for example, or cultural differences in pain perception. And so I think there is a real need to really enact the do no harm piece and see where even how we might be failing the individuals that are impacted the most by these things in their ability to heal and recover from it as well. So I think those biases and cut both ways. Not only are they impacted and victims, but then the amount of healthcare or the amount of healing or the amount of recovery is also diminished because of biases on the other side. And I think you're really in between a rock and a hard place, or you're being out of the frying pan in some cases and into the fire. Well, and so I think there's an important consideration to at least recognize that these things are real, impact the brain, change the brain, sometimes permanently, and how we need to both acknowledge that as a society, but also try to build in supports for more either culturally integrated therapeutic approaches, culturally informed therapeutic approaches, and how we may, and to also work towards undoing some of the distrust of the medical or the research establishment that exist in all sorts of minoritized communities and equity deserving groups, from indigenous populations to Black Americans and Canadians to Muslims to I think there is a real need for us to work on that end of it as well.
Absolutely. It's very problematic. And I also want to ask you about allyship. So is there any data about what is better and worse for people who want to be allies. And I'm going to give you an example that I worry a lot about. So I teach constitutional law and I teach anti-discrimination law, and I have a nice diversity in my class of students from different racial and otherwise, other kinds of identity group origins. And my con law class, I mean, it's basically a traumatizing class about the history of race relations in the United States. And I worry for my students who are in the class who are members of the groups who have been oppressed about what it feels like to sit through this, semester-long study of all of this, and especially being taught by a non-minority teacher. Like, it's very traumatizing for those students, and I don't know what to do about that. I mean, it really worries me every year.
I think there's some important thing that we should consider as far as allyship is concerned. I think there are cognitive barriers that often exist to allyship as well, and I think there is some of that implicit bias, but the interesting dynamics of guilt versus sympathy versus pride, and all of those things sort of come together to create barriers as well. And I think it's important that we consider those as we are thinking about it, right? Like, how do we balance between when does pride come into play versus when does guilt lead the charge, but then may result in forms of allyship or forms of advocacy that are less than effective? And how do we come from a truly justice-based, anti-racist based perspective in how we even enact that change, right? So I think there's importance to it's important to consider what allyship truly means. Obviously, this is not something that this is some things it's just I've learned through reading, and I don't know as much about, but there is now, at least I think just maybe last year or a year or two ago, Lucina Odin, who's a great neuroscientist and somebody I consider to be doing such wonderful work. She published a paper on cultivating allyship through casual mentoring and promoting diversity. So I think there's a role that mentors can play in cultivating healthy allyship. And then speaking of Lucina, she's actually published some really nice data looking at even in our little academic bubbles, which are always oozing with all sorts of layers of privilege. Right, we need to recognize that scientists from equity deserving groups often are undercited for the work they do compared to majoritarian groups, right? And so there are all sorts of layers to this that we can, I think, through more conversations like this, at least within our spheres of influence, when the next time we're on a committee that adjudicates an award, that adjudicates promotion, adjudicates any of these things that us as a little academic elite establishment hold close to our heart, that we recognize the biases that are inherent and systemic, and how hopefully we can turn the tide on some of these things.
So Jibran, you're a core researcher on the brain, and obviously you're looking at lots of aspects with respect to mental health and addiction and so on. But I think it's really important that we have people who really understand the brain, understand the science, that can look at the research in this general area of discrimination and the brain, and help sort out the good from the bad, so to speak, so we can maybe use good science to generate good policy. So I really appreciate the kind of approach you're taking, and that you're applying your knowledge of the brain to this very complicated problem.
Thank you, Terry.
Absolutely. Your role as a spokesperson, just to bring all of this, to be able to synthesize and bring this material to lay people, is really remarkable and such a contribution.
Thank you.
So I think we might be out of time. Yeah, we might have to. Any last words before we sign off from anyone?
No last words from me. This has been great, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with both of you today. And it has given me a lot to think about, and hopefully I can turn that some of that into some nighttime reading over the next couple of weeks.
Right. Well, thank you so much for participating in the podcast today as our guest and the Lobes and Robes. And again, very stimulating and thoughtful, provoking podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Well, that's it for this podcast episode. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, we welcome your feedback at neuroscience.policy@american.edu. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode, and do let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like to hear more about.